It is wonderful to see people from all over the world joining us, whether, some of us in North America, it's the evening, morning in Australia, morning in Asia. So wherever you are, whatever time zone you are, wonderful to have you here. I do have to say at the outset that I know that I have had some problems with my internet being slow this evening. So it may take just a little bit of a moment for the slides to actually come into focus. We've tried to troubleshoot that. And unfortunately, it's my kind of service provider and where I live at the moment. So in our time together, then in this session, there are a few questions we want to look at in terms of this idea of making thinking visible. So the first question is we want to think about, well, what kinds of thinking? So when we talk about making thinking visible, well, what do we mean by that? What kinds of thinking are we after? So we'll explore that. And then we also want to look at, well, what are the practices? So how is it that teachers can make thinking visible? And we'll also look at a picture of practice to help kind of ground these ideas. Just a little bit of background in terms of where these have come from. So I was a teacher for many years, began my teaching career in New Zealand before returning to the States, where I taught both primary level, I taught middle school math, before going to Harvard and beginning my career there as a researcher. So way back in 1998, the Spencer Foundation funded my research in classrooms where teachers were really adept at getting students to think, really good at developing their habits of mind, their thinking dispositions. And I wanted to study what these excellent teachers did. And one of the things I noticed there was these teachers who were so good at getting students to think, they never once taught a thinking skills lesson. Instead, they had routines and structures which they leveraged. So the whole idea of thinking routines, which we will be talking about as kind of a core practice today, comes from this idea of best practice. And then to zoom forward to where we are at kind of today. So we've been working with these ideas for over 20 years. Most recently, though, and just this year, Mark Church and I came out with a new book around the power of making thinking visible. So a lot of additional learning has happened in that kind of intervening span, as well as a lot of new routines as well. So with that, let's kind of jump in. I do want to tap just a little bit into kind of your experience here. We'll do some kind of quick sharing in chat before we get started. So working with people, all over the world, all the spans, you all have very different experiences, but I know that everyone has engaged in some efforts to make their students' thinking visible, to try to promote it, to try to encourage that thinking. So a couple of things you might think about is think about kind of where and when, have you had some success or seen some success in terms of promoting your students' thinking? Are there certain practices that you found really important and useful? And finally, kind of what puzzles might be coming up as you think about fostering thinking and making it more visible? So I just wanted to kind of get us warm up here. So pick one of those dot points there. Think about that. And if you could drop your response into chat real quickly, we'll see where people are at in terms of what things they have done, what things they might be struggling with, what things they find useful, as well as the questions and puzzles. So already seen there, lots of people talking about the idea of thinking routines, very familiar with that. The importance of getting students to feel comfortable sharing, and the idea that, when we're talking about thinking, we aren't just looking for correct answers, but we're really looking for students to actually share their individual thinking. You see a comment there from Steffi James. Also recognizing that this all exists in a context. The idea of making thinking visible exists within the context of trying to create a culture of thinking there. Some very specific routines. I see people mentioning the See, Think, Wonder. Seeing some people mentioning about the importance of kind of language that we're using to promote that. So lots of experience there. So I want to just kind of tap into that, recognize we're there. Hopefully in this session, then you'll kind of be able to get some ideas that attach to what you've already been doing and maybe answer some of those kind of questions as well. So when we talk about thinking, well, what do we mean by that? What do we, this word that is used all of the time? And in fact, thinking is one of the most frequently used words in the English language. So when we decided to kind of take this idea from best practice, the idea of teachers using routines and structures, and we were trying to develop more of those, we had to ask ourselves, well, what kind of thinking is really important in schools? What kind of thinking are we after? And there are lots of different ways that one might parse thinking. And one of the most familiar that most people experience at university is an exposure to kind of Bloom's taxonomy. But we kind of have some issues with Bloom. You can ask me that in the Q&A if you'd like, kind of afterwards. But we originally sat down and said, well, you know what? It is the thinking that leads to understanding is particularly important in schools and in classrooms. And so what we tried to do was to try to come up, not with the longest list of every kind of thinking imaginable, but actually try to come up with a short list of the kinds of thinking that really seemed to be necessary for understanding. And we identified what we call 8 kind of thinking moves, and we put them together in this graphic, which we call the understanding map. So let me kind of talk through those so that you can understand them a little bit more there. So the idea of describing what's there. So if there's something that we understand, we are able to identify the various parts and pieces and aspect of the things. And we are also able to see and notice more. And in fact, that ability to see and notice is one of the hallmarks of understanding. That we expect that our doctor can look at an x-ray and see and notice things that we might miss. That an art historian can look at a painting and see and notice things we might miss. So as we develop understanding, that ability to see and notice becomes one of the key hallmarks that we can recognize that development of understanding. The idea of wondering, questions and puzzles is really important. And I know that all of you as inquiry educators really value that idea of wondering and asking questions. But what I want to talk about here in terms of the wondering is how useful it is to think about this thinking move and how it helps us to make a distinction between knowledge and information and understanding. So as an adult, you can think of multiple times on a daily basis in which you gained new information, new knowledge without asking a single question. Because you can read something, you can hear something, you can watch something, you can get that new information without asking any questions. But I think you would be hard pressed to think of a time where you developed understanding without asking any questions. Even if those questions were just rolling around in your head, do I believe that? Do I agree with that? What does that connect to? How might I use that? Where does that go? What's that similar to? You're asking yourselves those questions to help you build understanding. And so what that tells us is that knowledge and information can be, not that they have to be, but they can be a passive enterprise, but understanding can never be passive. Understanding is always active. We always bring ourselves to the process of building understanding. The next one, considering different viewpoints and looking at things from different angles and perspectives. So if there's an issue that we are trying to understand, well, we kind of recognize that, if we have only looked at that issue from a single perspective, our understanding is limited. So as we add new perspectives, our understanding becomes enhanced. Reasoning with evidence. So as we are building our understanding, we are using the evidence, we are using the experience, we are using the data that we have at hand to help us in building our understanding. Making connections. So this one too also helps us make a distinction between knowledge and understanding. And one way that people sometimes talk about understanding and sometimes define it is they say that understanding is connected knowledge. So what that means is that when we are teaching for understanding, we are not neglecting knowledge in any way. It's just that we are making sure that that knowledge is connected And that does two really incredibly important things. Connected knowledge is easier to retain, and it is easier to transfer and apply. Well, for our students to do well on outside exams, it takes two things. It takes retention and transfer. So when we focus on understanding, we are aiding that retention and transfer. The idea of uncovering complexity is the recognition that understanding is an in-depth endeavor, that we have to get below the surface, that we have to kind of think about, well, what else is going on? Not just kind of that skimming surface level understanding. There's lots of talk in the world today in education circles about deep learning. And there are various definitions of deep learning. But one of the things that is always at the core of everyone's definition of deep learning is that deep learning is about understanding. The next one, the idea of capturing the heart and forming conclusions. Now, that does have the word conclusions in it, so that may lead you to think about like, oh, this happens at the very, very end of things. And, as teachers, we do often things when we wrap things up and we conclude, absolutely appropriate there. But the fact is, the way that our minds work, our minds are actually always engaged in this process of capturing the heart, of distilling the essence, of thinking about what is at the core of this. So we are always engaged in that process. And a good example of that is when we are reading a novel, and a new character gets introduced in that novel. Well, we form an opinion of that character right away, even though all of our understanding of reading has taught us that that character is going to change. I'm not going to feel the same about that character. What we can't do as readers is we can't say, oh, a new character has been introduced. I just will not think anything about this character until I get all of the information. You can't do it. Your mind likes to hold things. It likes to distill things. It likes to think about, well, what is this? Even though it can hold that very tentatively and it can change. So we're always engaged in that process. And then finally, the idea of building explanations. So we did settle on that word explanations there, but we would include interpretations and building theories that oftentimes when we are trying to understand something, we're engaged in that kind of explanations or interpretations. So we said that these 8 thinking moves were really necessary for understanding. And as we were designing the various thinking routines, then a key question for us always is, well, how does that connect? What kind of thinking is this routine helping to foster, helping to scaffold, helping to support, helping to prompt for students? And so a good place to start, those of you who might be a little bit new with the idea of thinking routines, a very good place to start is with this understanding map to think about, well, what kind of thinking are we after in this particular lesson? So with that as a background, now what I want to do is to move into the idea of, well, what are the practices? So now that we've talked about thinking, how do we make that thinking visible? And we have identified 4 different practices that are incredibly important. And the first one that I want to kind of mention, the one that perhaps is most on your mind, the one that I already have talked about, is the idea of thinking routines. And some things that can be really useful for us in beginning to apply a thinking routines. One of the our big goals in writing the new book, Mark and I, as we were writing, is, we wanted to give people the tools, the information, the advice, the support to make sure they don't use thinking routines as just activities. How do they use them meaningfully? How do they use them well? And sometimes at a workshop, say someone will come up to me and they'll say, I kind of like these routines, but how would I use them? How would I use them in math class? How would I use them in music? How would I use them in language teaching? Well, I found that I always ask the same questions when someone asks that. And the first question I ask is, well, what is it that you're wanting your students to understand? So that's a big idea because that's that recognition that our thinking is tied to understanding. The thinking routines are tools that help us to develop that understanding. So if you aren't clear about what you want students to understand, it may seem like someone has just handed you a bunch of tools that you don't have any use for. So if you're only expecting students to, take on the knowledge that you've delivered, spat it back to you, then the routines may feel like, these don't really seem necessary. So to make sure that they're tied to that agenda of understanding. And then the second question begins to kind of zero in on a particular lesson. So what kind of thinking is needed in order to engage with and make sense of a particular piece of content there? So now you're about to teach a lesson, you've got the content, you know that. Well, we often say that learning doesn't occur through the delivery of content. Learning only occurs when learners do something with that content, when they think about that content. So we need to get beyond the idea of planning lessons for delivery and the focus merely on content, but also the focus on what is the thinking that students need to do with that particular content. And only then are we kind of in the position to pick, well, what routine might best support and scaffold students' thinking. So 3 really important questions to kind of keep in mind as you're using the thinking routines. And another bit that I would just kind of add here that we also have learned is when we do recognize that the thinking routines are tools that are tied to the understanding map, then the way that we introduce a thinking routine is not by walking in and saying, today we're going to do a See, Think, Wonder. If you do that, you have just announced an activity. And instead, what you want to do is you want to announce the purpose. What is it you're wanting students to do? What is the learning that you're after? What is the thinking you want them to do? So you may say, we're beginning a new unit, and I found a really provocative image that I want us to really look at closely and see if we can kind of raise some questions that then we might pull into our unit. The tool that we're going to use to help our looking is the See, Think, Wonder routine. So announce the purpose and then announce the routine as a tool for accomplishing that purpose. And again, you can only do that if you have identified, well, what's the thinking that is needed? The second way that we might make thinking visible is through documentation. And those of you who are familiar with the Reggio Emilia preschools in Italy may already be somewhat familiar with the idea of documentation. At Project Zero, we've had a 35-year relationship with the Reggio Emilia preschools. So documentation is something that has been on our mind for a very long time, recognizing it as an important tool, both for teachers as researchers, but also for the learning of students. And similar to the idea of thinking routines, there are some key questions to ask yourself as you move into using documentation to make students' learning and thinking visible. So it could feel quite overwhelming because, when you think about it, well, what do I document? I could document everything. And so the first question is think about, well, what process and steps are important to capture? Because you don't want to spend time trying to capture everything. So beginning to set some priorities, what's really important there. And the second dot point there goes hand in hand and can really be useful in setting those priorities. So asking ourselves then, what do we want to document so that we can refer back to it? That is a key component of documentation and something that separates it from display. So we might put things up, we might kind of take student work, we might hang it up, and we might create some displays, and maybe students look at it and maybe they don't. Maybe visitors look at it, it just becomes a display, a decoration. But documentation is always returned to students, shared with them in a way that moves their learning forward. So think about that idea of, I want to capture this because we want to refer back to it as learners. The next 2 dot points are things that are not necessarily a part of the Reggio style of documentation. They're ones that we think a little bit more about, particularly because they apply to students as they get older. Not necessarily a lot older, because remember, Reggio is about early childhood. So as students begin to kind of do some more reading, do some more writing, they're moving forward. So another thing that we think about is where, when, and how might we use documentation to lessen the cognitive load? So the idea of cognitive load is that, our brains can only hold so much information in our working memory at once. We can increase that capacity by chunking and grouping things so that they become kind of a bundle to think about. And that's one effective way to do it. But another thing that helps us with that cognitive load and the idea that working memory is limited is to be able to download or distribute our thinking. So a good example of that is, let's say that you are, in a meeting with colleagues, you're planning a new unit, there are really great ideas, lots of things are kind of flying around, and all of a sudden someone just kind of stands up and goes over to the whiteboard and begins to write ideas down. And everyone kind of lets out a sigh of relief, because that's so useful, that's so helpful, because you no longer have to carry all of that in your mind. You're distributing, you're documenting, and lessening the cognitive load. And then also we want to think about, well, what parts of a routine might actually be self-documenting? Because again, as students get older, they actually may document themselves rather than in the Reggio style where the teacher is doing most of the documentation there. But once again, we need to think about that idea of, well, why are we having students document? And again, it's always because we want to refer back to it. We want to kind of capture these ideas because they're going to be an important reference point. So they aren't doing work for the teacher. They aren't filling in the sheet and then just handing it in to you. They're documenting because it facilitates the learning. The third practice I want to kind of talk about here is the idea of listening. So when we began to write the new book, and as it was evolving, one of the things we quickly kind of recognized was the importance of listening. And it kind of became a through line in the new book for us. It kept coming up over and over again from all the classrooms we were visiting. And similar to documentation, well, what do you listen for? It could be overwhelming because, again, you could listen for everything, but that's too much. So asking yourself that focusing question, what do you want to be listening for? So do you want to listen for the connections students are making? Do you want to listen for the questions? Do you want to listen for the misconceptions? So it's fine to have a goal for your listening, which is going to help kind of tune you in. And then think about, well, what are you curious to understand about students' process and about their thinking? Being students of our students, being curious about our students is a key component of making thinking visible. Because our students simply will not share their thinking with us if they think we are not interested. If they believe that our classroom is just about the right answer, they will spend all of their energy just trying to give us the right answers. And then when we try to ask them for their thinking, they feel like it's a trap. They feel like, we can't be trusted there because they've known from experience, what we really care about is just the right answer. So we truly have to be curious about our students. The best definition I have found of thinking is of listening, is listening is taking a vigorous interest in the other. And so we want to take that vigorous interest in our students. We might also think about there, that third dot point, what specific parts of the routine might provide occasions for listening? And this is not going to be a set answer, like, oh, for this routine, you listen here, for this routine, you listen here. Sometimes we give some tips around that way, but a lot of times this would just depend on what your goals are as a teacher. So sometimes you may be, if you were doing a See Think Wonder, you may really be listening for, are students able to notice details and notice nuances and notice some of the complexities in the image I'm sharing with them? Are they able to think and justify their thinking and interpretations other times? And other times you may be most interested in their questions. It's absolutely fine using a routine in a different context to have a different part of the routine that you might want to really focus in for your listening. And then finally, thinking about where you might stay silent so that you can actually listen for the learning. So a lot of research, I think John Hattie's research put the estimate of about 80%, some other people have been a little bit higher than that, of about how much teachers talk in a classroom. So teachers talk anywhere from 75 to 95% of the talk in classrooms is done by teachers. So we wanted to make sure that we kind of give our voices a little bit of a rest, that we are listening for the learning from our students there. And one very specific way that might manifest itself, what that might look like, it means that when we go over to a group, that is working and talking about an ideas, we make sure that we don't initially jump in with questions and comments and observations. We give ourselves a moment, we give our students a moment so that we can actually listen in on the conversation and listen in on the learning before we jump in. There's certainly a time to do all of that, but if we always are right there, right off the bat, we will actually deprive ourselves of the opportunity to listen in on the learning. And then finally, the fourth practice here is probably the way that teachers throughout millennia have made their students' thinking visible, and that is through questioning. And in particular, we found one particular type of question incredibly important, and it's what we call facilitative questions because they facilitate the thinking. Another way to recognize these questions is they are always the follow-up question. So we've asked a first question, student is given a response, and then we follow up with that to probe further. And a really, really powerful follow-up question, it's written there in that acronym, stands for, what makes you say that? So a student gives an answer and we just gently follow up with, well, what makes you say that? Showing that genuine interest and curiosity in our students. And it gives them that opportunity to explain, to elaborate, to justify, to give reasons and provide evidence there. We also might think about what key questions are embedded in any routine. And in fact, most of the routines are a series of questions. So the routine that lots of people know, again, see, think, wonder, that's really a set of questions. And that's also why when teachers turn the see, think, wonder routine into a recording sheet, here's your see column, here's your think column, here's your wonder column, it tends not to be very effective with that routine. Because again, this routine is really a series of questions. It's what do you see? And what else do you see? And what more do you see? And can you see anything else? And then, and what does that make you think? And what else does that make you think? And what more does that make you think? And what are you wondering? And what other questions do you have? And what other puzzles are there? So this is a see, think, wonder is a dynamic routine that is a conversation built on those three questions. And when we reduce it to a 3-column recording sheet, we are stripping it of all of its dynamic interplay, and it very rarely runs as richly when it's down on paper as when it is as conversation. And then finally, teachers ask a lot of questions, and I would never encourage teachers to necessarily ask fewer questions because questions are incredibly important. But we do also need to make room for student-generated questions. Think about those emerging. And I know, once again, with people in terms of inquiry, that you are very familiar with asking questions. And a lot of those questions come, they're the inquiry questions at the beginning of the unit. But some research that just came out last year showed that students generating questions about content is one of the most effective ways for them to study for tests. So if you work with older students and you test loom large, it's a very effective studying technique because asking yourself those questions is allowing you to dig into the content. And as I said before, that idea of wondering, those questions are one of the ways that we recognize the understanding and how it is different from knowledge. But even with knowledge, asking questions helps us to make that knowledge something that we can kind of lock on to and help us retain more effectively. So with these four types or four practices, I've kind of got them laid out here, kind of right on a row. We can talk about them very discreetly, as I just have. But I want to now kind of reorganize these to help show you a little bit more dynamically how we should think about these in our classrooms. Let me just describe what I just did there. So you can see thinking routines, it's right there in the center. I also deliberately wrote thinking routines in black and white. So what adds color to a thinking routine? What supports the thinking routine is when we surround the thinking routines with listening, with documentation, with questioning. That's what really elevates the routine and ensures that it's not just an activity there. And we've produced a lot of videos of teachers using routines. We've written, lots and lots of pictures of practice of teachers using routines. And when it comes down to it, what makes a good video that we choose to actually, kind of produce and invest the time in terms of editing, what makes a good picture of practice that we want to write up? Every single time, it's not just, oh, that's a good use of that routine with that content. It's no, in the classroom, we saw, yes, good use of the routine, good marriage with the content, but also the teacher surrounded that with the listening, the questioning, and the documentation. And of course, this is a Venn diagram. And so when we create a Venn diagram, we create some points of intersection. So just kind of highlight those. So that intersection between the documentation and the questioning there. So we can think about, well, what are the questions which are actually driving the learning to help tell the story there? That intersection between our listening and documentation, thinking about from our listening, how are we capturing that learning and thinking that's emerging, and how are we feeding it back to our students? And then finally, that intersection between the listening and the questioning, how am I showing students that I'm actually curious and interested in their responses? Because if our students, again, don't think that we are curious about their thinking, they will play guess what's in the teacher's head and try to give us their correct answer. So look at those practices. What I want to do now, we're kind of pretty further along in the session. So this is the big last kind of big piece of content, but I want to give a chance to kind of ground this in a picture of practice. Well, what does this look like? And so we're going to take a look at a classroom here. This is a classroom from the International School of Amsterdam. It was when Susan Loban, she's still at the school, but when she was teaching year 5 at the school, teaching a unit on immigration. So as you are watching this, some things I'd like for you to kind of think about, and feel free to drop into chat. You might want to wait until the whole thing comes up, but if you're a person where it's useful to you to think as you're watching, feel free to do that as well too. So one thing to think about is, well, what kind of thinking is Susan trying to promote? Can you discern that in her classroom? And then just think about where you see any examples here of powerful listening or questioning or documentation going on. You're going to see the routine. The routine is Connect, Extend, Challenge routine. You'll see that. But think about, for our purposes here, how is Susan surrounding it with the questioning, the listening, and the documentation?
Well, the children have been reading some novels about migration because our unit is on migration. And the plan for today is to have them share and reflect on the art installations that they have created, with a goal of having them get to a Connect, Extend, and Challenge thinking routine. I've chosen that because this is a long project that we've been doing. It's gone over 8 weeks of different tasks. And the purpose for today is to have them connect with their original thinking, have a quick look at what it is that they are, at how their thinking's been changed or extended, but primarily to get the next direction. Where do they want to go with their thinking? What's challenging them? What are their burning issues? All right, so what kinds of things did you think about before, or were you thinking you knew or understood before? And how has what you've done or understood lately connected to that? How has it either reaffirmed that or made you wonder about that? So think about some of the things you thought about migration before. Jonathan?
I used to think migration was like, yippee, we're moving to California or whatever. And now I know it's like, you can be forced to move and sometimes.
Well, before I thought it was only rich people, but now I know it's mostly poor people because they can't survive in the country they're in, so that's why they migrate to a different country for a better life.
Okay.
And sometimes they suffer during the migration. That happens a lot.
Mm-hmm. So you're trying to make connections with the kinds of people that migrate.
Yeah.
Okay.
I found out that people normally die when they migrate,
Uh-huh.
and they don't have that good material to go in. They would have enough food and everything good.
Okay. So you're connecting to experiences on the journey. Now, did anybody go back to, remember at the very beginning of our unit, we looked at our own family's migration history? Turn to someone close to you and really quickly say if you think you found a connection that you can relate what you've learned to really quickly.
The rich people, they have a wonderful life. They have everything they want.
My family was like kind of pushed out of Europe because of war, and most the issues that we're studying about migration, like the people were pushed out of their own country.
From my mom's side, her family was really poor, and they never had the money to migrate. They never had a chance to even survive a migration.
So poverty is a connection
Poverty.
you've made in...
Yeah, a big connection because my grandpa, he had a terrible life as a child. He had a really hard time.
Uh-huh. So, loads and loads of connections. What are some of the ways that doing this and studying this novel has really stretched your thinking about migration? Take a minute and just think about that.
Like make them go and talk to it.
Okay, so,
I mean, I realized that this is not just a storybook. This is something that really happened.
Uh-huh.
And No Government Island was a true story. And this is something that really happens all around the world now, even.
so an extension of your thinking has been the realness
Yeah,
of some of the negative things about migration.
I think it stretched my feeling to migration
Mm-hmm.
because I learned that this migration was really hard to go on the boat or airplane and during on it and even impact in different place.
Okay, so it's really stretched your thinking. I heard the word impact on the different place. Jonathan?
Well, I also didn't know that migration could be so tough and bad, and me and my group, we had to expand our thinking with the conflict of the main government in Afghanistan.
Uh-huh. So one of the things that stretched for you was just the sheer difficulty of migration and also the kinds of conflicts that cause migration. Is that what was expanded?
I found out that people shouldn't be pushed out.
By having these questions recorded and not just raised in a discussion, but by documenting them, they're there for us to explore further. They're there for us to think about further. So, what are some of the issues that are really challenging you now at this point? I mean, you've come a long way in 8 weeks of learning and thinking about migration. You've done your own project, you've done your own novels, you've done your own family history for migration, lots and lots of time to think about it. Now, what are you wondering about? And what are the really burning issues for you about migration that you're still not sure about? It challenges you.
Well, do the refugees have to get back to their own country, or do they live, and what happens to them?
why can't some places just let their borders open to some people?
Okay, why can't borders just be open? Yeah, Joanne.
Why can't women, some parts of the world, women be like this, treated like people?
Okay.
Men.
Well, I think our next step then is to have a go at these. Okay? To do an inquiry into your own questions, because your questions have changed so much from the beginning to now. I mean, the questions at the beginning was, if I remember, were what was immigration? What's the difference between immigration and emigration? Who are the people who migrate? Remember those questions, yeah. These are a little bit different now. And I think that the next step for us then is let's put these up and we'll do a little bit of thinking about them this week. And then next week, we'll get started on having a go at exploring a few of them. Now, is there anything that's not on here? What I noticed in using the routine today was that it facilitated a really rich conversation amongst us, either when they were in their pairs or when we were working as a group about the issues of migration. I think the questions that they raised today were really significantly different than the ones that came before we did this. Today, the questions that I heard after our discussion or during our discussion were perspective-based, point of view-based. They had a lot of gray areas to them. They were questions that would require someone to investigate the why, not the what.
Okay, so a lot of people have already kind of been in the chat and kind of shared some ideas. So if you haven't yet, think about what you saw there in terms of any examples of powerful listening, of questioning, of documentation. One of the things I've noticed already is that people have talked a lot about the conversation. And of course, a conversation has both that listening and the questioning happening there. The conversation in this case was facilitated by that documentation. So you saw all of those things kind of happening there. Lots of people have mentioned the idea of time. And again, when we think about the discourse in a classroom, time is a really important component of that. And so making sure there is time to think, there is time to question, there is time to connect and explore. So she asked lots of facilitative questions that kind of lead, that probe students. Several people have commented that Susan really did demonstrate that idea that she was interested. You could tell that she was actually interested into her students. She listened to what they say. She reworded things, checked on the wording, made sure it was appropriate before she kind of wrote that down there. So in closing up here, and then we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So we've got these 4 practices, but again, I don't want you to think that the 4 practices just kind of sit there as static things that we just employ. Making thinking visible also is a goal that we embrace. And then again, that is what actually begins to kind of motivate and give some life to all of these practices. So in thinking about this goal, we kind of have the mindset, the understanding that teaching is much more than telling and delivery, that we really want our students to be engaged with ideas, asking questions, exploring and constructing meaning, and not absorbing. So when we have that goal, again, these practices begin to make sense. We find a place for them. Another thing that motivates these practices is becoming students of our students. So lots of times people are very top in their mind is assessment, formative assessment, summative assessment. Well, if you want a window in to how your students are making sense of ideas, how they are building understanding, where they're at, we have to make their thinking visible. That is the window that we need. And finally, keeping our eye on the big picture, on the far horizon. In education, too often we have very, very short-term goals. So we want to think about who our students are becoming as thinkers and learners as a result of their time with us. What will they be like as adults? So how is it that we are modeling the thinking? How is it that we are scaffolding and supporting that thinking so that students walk away from our classrooms, not only with a good understanding of content, but also with the toolkit for the thinking that they can move forward. So the handouts today, if you're interested in those, you can find them at my website, just ronritter.com. You'll find a tab there for resources and then infographics. Look there, PDF documents there, and then the ideas that we've talked about today. Also, if you want to read more about those from the book, The Power of Making Thinking Visible. So with that, I will invite Chandra back in and we will move on to some questions and answers.
Thanks for that really powerful session, Ron. It was great that you had the chance to scan through chat as well, just so you can see the complete breadth of comments that people have left. There are a few questions and a good 10 minutes for us to do question answers. So I think we can take quite a few. To kick it off, I think you gave a lot of people, you left them with a lot of curiosity when you said that you have thoughts on Bloom's taxonomy. So there are 4 or 5 people who have said, now that you've mentioned it, they would love to know what your thoughts are.
Um, so several thoughts. So one, people are using the word Bloom's taxonomy. A taxonomy is just a division, but the way that most of us have been taught Bloom's taxonomy is with the pyramid. So we've been taught it as a hierarchy. So I would have fewer objections if it were just a taxonomy. Here are different types of thinking. So our understanding map is actually a better example of how you display a taxonomy. There's no hierarchy there. So putting things in that triangle, that pyramid, and talking about it as a hierarchy is problematic. So again, and also not Bloom's original intent there. And the reason why it's problematic is it's just simply problematic to talk about higher and lower types of thinking. So to say, oh, evaluation is at the very top. Well, if you ask a 5-year-old to evaluate, does this paper airplane fly? They can do it quite easily. It doesn't take much higher order thinking to do that. Yep. So thinking is always married with content. And this is why, for some 60 years, people focusing on thinking, there are no good tests or measurements of thinking because we always think with content. And so that's what makes something challenging. And then the very last thing I would say that's kind of another big kind of red flag for me is Bloom put understanding as one of his types of thinking. Understanding is not a type of thinking. Understanding is a goal of thinking. And so understanding is an outcome of our thinking, not a type of thinking. So those are all of my objections.
No, I think, at least for me personally, yes, for me as well, a lot of my own induction to this taxonomy has been in the form of that hierarchical pyramid. So what you say, I think, is relieving to a certain extent as well, because teachers often might feel like they have to push their students instantly to creation or evaluation. So no, thanks for sharing that. Just taking off from what you just said right now in terms of how it's always tied to content and evaluation of this might not always be the end outcome. There is a question here which says, how do we give feedback on thinking routines in a way that students are pushed to think in the next level, but also, teachers are able to respect their thoughts? So any tools or things that you can suggest for teachers to give good feedback?
Yeah, and I think that comment there kind of ties. So we do believe that thinking routines are powerful formative assessment tools. They give us that window in, and then an idea on feedback. So going back to that idea of, again, thinking routines as tools. So if you begin a lesson and say, here's the thinking we're after, we're going to use this routine as a tool for that, you've actually set yourself up very well to debrief at the end. Because you can then say, remember, we were using the tug of war routine to help us uncover some layers of complexity and some different perspectives. How did that work? What are some things that we might remember going on to next time? And then the next time as a teacher, you can say, I remember last time people talked about that it was a little bit challenging to get out of their own heads and to think about other perspectives. So that's something we want to do this time. So keeping that tool-like aspect can be really helpful in then providing the feedback.
Got it. There's a question here from Katie Stone where she says, what is your personal first thinking routine to begin with? I know that it depends on the purpose, but for a school that's just beginning on their thinking journey, what would be best? How would you introduce and spend time?
So the easiest one to implement and the biggest bang for the buck is what makes you say that. So that's a routine we wrote about in the first book, Making Thinking Visible. Very powerful, doesn't take a lot of planning. write a note to yourself, write the question out so it's on your desk so that you see it, and just begin to start asking what makes you say that more. And you will be amazed at the kind of thinking that you get. So that's the one that I always say that people should start with and begin to kind of integrate right away into their teaching repertoire.
Great. Sorry, quick correction. The question's from Kristen Blum, but hopefully, Kristen, that answered that for you. Another question I do want to take, because this is the reality for many teachers across the world, is, it's a question from Liam. He says, what might be some strategies for having the same type of conferencing methods when faced with a 30-to-1 student ratio, or a more, a more difficult student ratio? So how do you still deliver on these conferencing techniques?
Well, I do have to say that one reason why often we have videos with small numbers of students is just because of the audio issue of being able to kind of capture the audio from the students, which makes it look like the class is very small. But so what typically is happening is, you may not, you may be facilitating the whole discussion as a teacher, or you may be having, once the routine is more familiar, or if students are older, they can be doing that discussion in smaller groups. And you can then be kind of monitoring the groups and listening in for the learning kind of the groups. So this doesn't require that you have small groups for that. So a lot of times teachers, the first time using a routine, they may do it with the whole class as a way of modeling it, or they may use the fishbowl technique as a way of modeling it with a small group where all the other students are standing around, and then students begin to do it kind of more independently in groups.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. I think we have time. We have about 2 minutes to close out the session. So I'm going to take one last question for you. It's from John Salgado, and he says, do you think that content enhances understanding? Could you elaborate? There was another question, right? Sorry.
I'm not understanding the question exactly. Content and?
Do you think content essentially enhances understanding in any way? Like, how can they use content? I guess my understanding of the question is, how can you take the most advantage of content to then, transfer it to understanding with visible thinking routines? Could you elaborate how one might take the content and then translate that to understanding?
Well, so it depends on what kind of curriculum guides you're working with, but a lot of content gets presented as information. Here's information for students. So students need to know about this event, or they need to read this book. Instead of thinking about, well, what do they need to understand from that? What is worthwhile of understanding? So the content itself doesn't necessarily always kind of tell us, and sometimes the curriculum documents don't even telegraph for us what's important and what is worthwhile to understand. Sometimes they do, some curriculum documents do, but think about kind of those key understandings with that. And, one of the things that will do for you as a teacher is, once you've identified, well, what's worth understanding here around this content, then it actually makes the content more engaging for students, because now it's not flat, it's not two-dimensional, but it actually kind of comes to life there.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ron. There are so many other questions, but Ron's available on Twitter as well. Do take a look at the website that he's suggested as well. So hopefully, we have many more opportunities to further our thinking and learning on visible thinking routines with Ron. Before we conclude, just a quick reminder: if you'd like to explore Toddle further, please use the link in the chat box. And a small reminder also to the fundraiser that we have going now to help vulnerable children in India. So if you're interested, please make a donation of any size if you'd like. And again, Ron, thanks so much. This is honestly a wonderful way for us to kickstart our second day. We're just getting started. Right up next, guys, we have your workshop tracks. So we have Darnell Fine, who's going to be talking in the leadership track. That it's going to be great. He's talking about how to really push for agency in a way that you really democratize learning for students, your thoughts will be challenged. So let's head there definitely. There is a primary years workshop by Jo Fahy, and if you're an early years educator especially, I think it'll be great for you. But she also has a lot of learnings in there if you're a primary educator as well. And lastly, middle years workshop we have with Darnell Fine, and the leadership workshop with Maxine Driscoll. So make sure to tune back in there. And you can find links in the chat, in the agenda, as well as in the calendar invite. Thanks again, Ron. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Okay.